up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to the Homebrewed Christianity Podcast. Since 2008, I've been bringing you ideological ingredients so you can brew your own faith, wrestling with big religious, philosophical, scientific, theological questions. And today, we got a special episode. That's right. Not just is this a special episode because we have JC himself on the podcast. That's right, John freaking Cobb. Oh, no. This is also a special announcement because starting in a month from now, in the middle of March 2020, John Cobb and I are going to be facilitating probably the greatest, largest, most zesty online seminar of Alfred North Whitehead of all time. All right. Alfred North Whitehead, the mathematician, the metaphysician, early 20th century pioneer of the philosophy of organism. That's right. The man, the myth, the legend behind process philosophy himself, Alfred North Whitehead. We're going to have a class that digs in to his masterpiece, his magnum opus, his cosmology, his propositions that found a process metaphysics, a process philosophy. You know why? Because at Homebrewed Christianity, we've talked about this stuff for a long, long time. And so many of you have said, I want to know more about this process thinking. You know what? Some people, because, I don't know, it's essential part of eco-philosophy and thinking through life on this planet and you don't want to kill the world. Or some of you get into it for theological reasons because it takes participation and mutual indwelling seriously. Others get into it because it addresses the problem of evil in a unique and sophisticated way. Others because you're interested in the philosophy of mind and a way in which we don't just privilege the human psyche as the only psyche in creation and then hence devaluing all other living things. Some of you just go, I like when you have process people on. It's a school of thought that thought feminism wasn't antithetical to Christianity and really sparked a whole bunch of the early feminist theologies in the U.S. and abroad. I mean, there's so many different reasons people find out about Whitehead process philosophy. And then what do? They're like, I want to read this Whitehead guy. And you try and it's hard. It's not easy, especially if you're not used to reading philosophy. But even if you are, he's not the easiest, you could say. Well, what would happen if the single greatest living interpreter of Alfred North Whitehead, John Cobb, was to help you wrestle with Whitehead's most prestigious, influential text, Process and Reality? What if you were going to go directly to the source and read it with the wisdom and guidance of the one and only John B. Cobb Jr. That's right. He will be 95 years old and he is still rocking and socking like that philosophical activist and United Methodist theologian that he is. That's right. John Cobb is going to be facilitating an online seminar as we work through Process and Reality. And on this episode today, you're going to hear a brief lecture, you could say. It's a 30-minute lecture where he tells you why Whitehead is worth studying and gives you an idea of what we're going to talk about in the class. And it's amazing. So here's what's going to happen. You can go to processandreality.com or you could go to alfrednorthwhitehead.com, both of which will send you to the page you can sign up. In this class, we're launching it as part of the new Claremont Institute for Process Studies. So in the town of Claremont, where I did my PhD, they are launching a new center there. And I wanted to help spread the word, help raise some money for it, to continue to connect all the dots they're doing. And they're doing some amazing work, which you'll hear about, including launching different centers of process studies in China. They're invested in a lot of ecological activism and working across different disciplines in the sciences, in the social sciences, to making a difference in local politics, to international politics around ecological issues and things. But John Cobb is just a wonderfully kind and brilliant man, and he's going to be introducing this. So just go to alfrednorthwhitehead.com or processandreality.com. Sign up. And here's the thing. We want this to be the largest seminar of Whitehead of all time. So we're doing it in donation-based way. You can donate whatever you want. You can donate a large amount. You can donate a zero amount. If you donate whatsoever, you'll also get a PDF version of Cobb's book. That outlines definitions to all of Whitehead's words. It's called the Whitehead Word Book. You could say that's a convenient title, given it's a book that gives definitions of all the vocabulary words that might be hard. And then we'll be going through the text, getting introduced to it together. Each week, Cobb will give a lecture. Then I will ask him some questions, and then everyone in the group will be able to look at the text, look at that content, and then submit more questions. Cobb and I will answer some, and I'm even having some friends, process legends of sorts, join in so you can hear in special sessions throughout the class different ways Whitehead's work has impacted them. So like my friend, Just Catherine Keller, another JC, will be joining in, and you can see how Whitehead helped shape her work as in a kind of like engaging post-structuralism and that kind of stuff with Whitehead. And then we're going to have some of my other friends. You can probably guess how this is going to go. I'm just super excited, right? And I want you to help me, not just sign up, because this is going to be one of the most fun, super nerdy things of all time. But I also want you to invite your friends, right? The reason it's donation based is so we could get as many people to be a part of this conversation. And it's going to be an intense philosophical conversation, because we actually need new tools than the assumed philosophical tools so much of our economy, our university, and our religion are working on. We like to see things as clear and distinct objects bumping up against each other. And when we find a problem, we point at it, we get rid of it, or we fix it or something. And what Whitehead is inviting us into is a world that is a collection of interpenetrating, interconnected subjects. That where the problems lie is when we make things a thing and don't recognize the habits of perverse power that we ignore at the heart of things. There's so many exciting possibilities that if we get more individuals in different fields, in different vocations, thinking about relationships, thinking about perverse patterns of power, thinking about ways we commit to the whole, that we will open up new avenues. So yeah, I hope you consider joining the class, learning some Whitehead, and I think of it this way. John Cobb is turning 95 right before we launch this class. Christmas is obviously, the birthday of Jesus of Nazareth. But why not have an online birthday party for John Cobb, where we have the world's largest Whitehead seminar of all time? Oh yeah. And the last thing I was going to say real quick is just, if this is not the best time for you to go through Process and Reality, you can join and you'll get sent the audio and video of everything to use at whatever appointed time you want to do it. You know what I mean? So just sign up, and then you can collect the stuff, go back through the group, and get whatever you need at it when you have time to wrestle with the text. And if you're a member of the Homebrewed community, know that you'll get all of the info for this text in the members only podcast feed. You won't have to download anything. You won't have to go do any extra effort to get all the content for the class. It will be delivered in the podcast feed itself. So yeah, get prepared. There'll be lectures, there'll be Q&A, there'll be group interaction in a Facebook group of everyone in the group. Everyone that donates will get the Whitehead Word Book, and you'll be a part of the biggest Whitehead seminar of all time, a celebratory expression of love for John Cobb and his contribution, and you'll help get a relational worldview in the minds and hearts and hopefully embodied practice of more people. So this is John Cobb saying why Whitehead and giving us an invitation to this group. Enjoy.
Trip Fuller and I are planning a series of sessions on, of all things, an extremely difficult book. It's called Process and Reality. And the author of Process and Reality was named Alfred North Whitehead. And he had been a very successful lecturer. Many of his lecture series are available still today, and I recommend them. But he had been then invited to give the Gifford Lectures, and he thought that he had better use this occasion to present his ideas or get his ideas organized in a fully systematic, rigorous, comprehensive way. So 600 people came to hear him. And he gave his first lecture. 6 people came back the next night. So Process and Reality has a deserved reputation as a difficult book to tackle. But even so, there are a good many people who think it's worth the pain and effort to understand this book. So I'm entitling this lecture, Why Whitehead? And it will really be not only Why Whitehead, but Why Process and Reality. That will be a very brief appendix. Most people, when they think of a philosopher, think that the philosopher is one philosopher among many philosophers, and to make a judgment that this one philosopher is right and all the other philosophers wrong is something you could only do after years of study of this whole range of philosophers. So that to pick out one and give special attention to that one, especially a difficult one, is not a sensible thing to do. So I think it's important to understand that there are schools of philosophy, not simply different ways of answering the same questions, but really dealing with different topics. For example, Martin Heidegger, certainly one of the great thinkers of recent times, but he was a phenomenologist. And many of the great thinkers like Wittgenstein, he worked with language. Whitehead's work was with cosmology. Process and Reality is entitled An Essay in Cosmology. So when I say why Whitehead, the question is, why be interested in cosmology? If you are interested in cosmology, then the number of people who have written cosmologies, serious people who have written serious cosmologies in the last century is very few. Cosmology is not a topic that has been taught in most departments of philosophy. So the question is not why out of all these hundreds of brilliant philosophers would one pick Whitehead? Why would you be interested in studying cosmology? Well, I think that the lack of interest in teaching cosmology in universities has left a rather serious hole in our education. I'll try to explain what I mean by cosmology. Until the 18th century, everybody who did philosophy did something in the field of cosmology, might emphasize different things. Cosmology is the attempt in a very sophisticated way to organize answers to questions about the nature of reality, about the human place in that reality, about whether we have responsibility for our actions or really everything is determined. What is the purpose of human life? How is human life connected with the whole of the natural world? So forth and so on. I'm not trying to list all the topics of cosmology, but these are questions that human beings who are thoughtful and curious are very likely to raise. And to decide that, well, we can't deal with those questions is to dismiss cosmology. Now, the term cosmology is used primarily when the answer to those questions is sought in a world in which the natural sciences have transformed the way in which people think. In other words, it's bringing what we have learned from natural science to bear upon human questions that have been asked from the time of the Greeks, no doubt even before that. The period that Whitehead refers to particularly is the early modern period. That's the period when the natural sciences were taking shape and were revealing vast amounts of information that had simply not been available with any reliability before that time. So how do we answer the question about what's the relation of human beings and the natural world in a world in which we now know a great deal about the natural world that we didn't know before? So to write a cosmology, one really needs to know science well. And Whitehead was a mathematical physicist and knew the other sciences quite well. But the point is simply, this is a particular task that has not been dealt with, and I'll come back to that topic, in our universities in the last century, so that Whitehead's thought has been somewhat separate from the mainstream of philosophical teaching. That is complicated, as I'll point out, by the response to the evolutionary theory of Darwin. So that for a brief period, there was a renewal of interest in cosmology, but it has faded. Okay, so why study cosmology? Well, it's awfully hard not to care a little bit about the knowledge that we have that is relevant to our lives, what we do with our lives, how we understand the world around us, how we understand the relation of human beings to that natural world, how we understand the relation of our factual information and what we care about, our values, our goals, and so forth. And I think if you're not interested in that, if those questions are not important to you, don't take this course. There are other things you can study that are really quite a bit easier. This is an infinite task. No one will ever complete cosmology unless we stop studying science and there's no new information coming in from there, or stop asking questions that I think of as human questions that thoughtful people bring up. So I'm going to let that be my answer. If you're not interested in cosmology, definitely don't try to read difficult material in answer to those questions. If you are interested in cosmology, then at least you'll know you have a small body of philosophers from whose writings to choose rather than a vast one. Okay, so the second question is, why do we need a new cosmology? Obviously, Whitehead's cosmology is very different from any previous cosmology. And I don't think that should be too difficult to understand. We need a new cosmology because we have a lot of information now that the Greeks didn't have and the early moderns didn't have. And secondly, the early moderns who worked on cosmology came to an impasse. And the reason the university dropped the study of cosmology is because they couldn't deal with the questions. And I will try to explain that, because you might think that this was just an ongoing task and doesn't have a history that makes a huge difference. But David Hume, who was intended to be a cosmologist, discovered, and I should say, he wanted to do science in a radically empirical way. He thought the only access we had to the world external to our bodies was through our sense organs. So he didn't think that a cosmology could talk about things that were not accessible to sense organs. But at the heart of the natural sciences is the issue of causality. You can say that when the natural sciences explain something, usually that means they have identified the efficient cause. I mentioned that because the Greeks talked about 4 causes. They said there's an efficient cause, and there's a material cause, and there's a formal cause, and there is a final cause. The final cause means purpose. And in the early modern world, science freed itself from final causes. So modern science is a science that does not explain anything in terms of its purpose. If you try to bring in a purpose, you will be told that's not scientific. Well, I think that this is an indication of why we need to bring philosophical reflection to science, because maybe one of its problems is that it dismissed final causes from inclusion, whereas we all know that purposes do play a role in the world. So science, in denying purposes, seems to be arbitrarily limiting itself. That to me is the kind of topic that needs to be discussed and not just ignored. But you can't bring it up in the university today, because scientists will just tell you that's science. I think they need to study cosmology. In any case, since David Hume could not see or touch a cause, he said, we cannot introduce the idea of cause into philosophy, and yet science is all about causes. We're in real trouble. Well, Immanuel Kant agreed that you couldn't talk about causes from an empirical point of view, but he said, we know they function, or rather, we know that we can only understand the world in terms of the functioning of causes. So causes are something that our human mind imposes upon the empirical data. Well, I don't want to get too deeply into cosmology, but this will give you some idea. And Kant then dismissed the effort to introduce causes into the philosophical and into the objective world, but explained why we have to think in terms of causes when we are talking about the natural world. And that solution to the problem, I don't consider it a good solution, but that is the solution that has ruled Western thinking for the last centuries, since the time of Kant. But that meant that cosmology no longer, I should say, philosophers gave up on doing cosmology. That's why it ceased to be a part of the philosophy that was taught. Now, if you don't have if you cannot explain causes, then you have to stick with the empirical data without explaining, thinking that it is explaining something beyond itself. And that's called phenomenology. The phenomena are just the appearances. So one type of philosophy, Martin Heidegger is a great exemplar of that, very carefully analyzes, observes, and describes human experience. And dimensions of human experience have been brought to the fore by the phenomenologists that were never noticed before. I'm in no way trying to belittle it. But if you're satisfied to think that all we can talk about is the appearances, and we can't ask the question if there's any reality behind the appearances or within the appearances, then study the phenomenologists. I think all of us have, even those who deny it, all of us are pretty sure there really is a world out there, not simply patches of color and sound and so forth. So to exclude reflection about what's really there is very unsatisfactory to me. And if you feel the same dissatisfaction, then I recommend you take a chance on cosmology rather than accept the more acceptable kind of philosophy which sticks with the appearances. Existentialism grew up in very close connection with phenomenology. And I think these are very important. I'm just saying what is left out, what has been left out for the past 2 centuries is an attempt to answer the questions in a realistic way. And I think if you're interested in the effort to deal realistically, and I hope you understand by realistically I mean not just the appearances, but what the appearances are appearances of, what is actually going on out there. Now, scientists are constantly adding to our information about what is going on out there. So one can say the scientists are only dealing with the appearances, but it doesn't fit very well with the way they report the results of what they're doing. So I think that the present state of philosophy, if this is philosophy, is very unsatisfactory. And I also think the state of science is unsatisfactory. The implication of what the scientists tell us now is that in addition to the world they're comfortable in, and that's the world that can be dealt with in Cartesian terms. That means the world that can be understood deterministically in terms of material things. In addition to that, many of them are now saying the one thing they can't get hold of is consciousness. So they give us a world in which there is this clockwork, this consciousness, and then in addition to that, they're not able to make the Cartesian world fit with the quantum world. So we have the quantum world with its principles and forms of behavior. We have the clockwork world, and we have consciousness. And there's no understanding of how they're related to each other. Well, that's the task of cosmology. And I feel the need for some explanation at that level. So that's one reason, and you can't get that by reading the Greeks. And you can't get that by reading the early moderns, because they didn't. They thought there were the world of mind and the world of body, but of course they didn't know anything about the quantum world. And the efforts to understand that world in Hume and Kant broke down. So we can't just go back to somebody in the past if we are seriously interested in cosmology. We have to begin with thinking that is rooted in the present state of science. And because it's impossible to understand the quantum world, which is the most basic world, with the categories of thought that scientists like to use, it seems we almost have to change the basic categories of thought and try to understand the world that scientists are comfortable in from the side of the quantum world rather than the other way around. So all of this is simply to say something. If we are interested in these questions, we can find a few people who have done very creative work, very few, and their work is not taught much in universities. I mean, this comes and goes. I don't want to say. Whitehead was taken very seriously when he was alive. But in the United States, there's very, very little teaching of his thought in philosophy departments. And I think that says something about the university that I do not think is admirable. But that's one way of putting it. A second reason for reviving cosmology is the theory of evolution. Almost all respected scientists now believe that human beings evolved from simpler organisms. If we evolve from simpler organisms, dualism is sort of a very strange way of looking at that. You can't really say where the mind came into being. And if it came into being gradually in evolving process, you can't think of it as being something of a radically different sort from what existed before. So virtually no scientist wants to affirm dualism of that kind. But it's a very profound change of worldview. If you think that we are evolved from the same sources that this wood is evolved from, we are like it in some respects. Or it seems that we must be like it in some respects. We have common ancestry. We're kin. We're kin to everything. And that seems to call for fresh thinking. And that fresh thinking would be cosmology. And in fact, cosmology had a kind of revival as a result of the evolutionary debates and controversies. And that needs to play a large role in a contemporary cosmology. If we had to have a cosmology, of course you can just say, let's not think about those things. I am personally dissatisfied with the university system that solves most problems by saying, let's not think about them. That's not what universities were created to do. They were created to help us think about things, not to tell us not to think about things. So I'm obviously making a case, and I'm intending to. I'm not trying to be neutral. I think cosmology is important. And I think we need to think in terms of evolution, and we need to think in terms of the quantum world, and we need to think in terms of Einstein's relativity theory. And we need to think in terms of all kinds of new discoveries about life. I mean, there's so much that has gone on that to go back to a cosmology that doesn't take account of any of that surely is not a happy solution. So I think the need for new cosmology, and we should organize best thinkers to put together a new cosmology. Whitehead did it on his own, so I'm not at all saying Whitehead has done everything in a final way, so nobody else needs to contribute. We need lots of work on cosmology. But there's no need to reinvent a lot of things that Whitehead has already done for us. Okay, then finally, if we agree we need a new cosmology, then the question is why Whitehead? And I'll give a very simple answer to that. The main alternative to Whitehead is Bergson, Henri Bergson. And by saying I choose Whitehead, I'm not trying to belittle Bergson. But Bergson was in the biological sciences, and I don't think he can help us much with quantum and relativity. The issues that are dealt with by mathematical physics are not immediately accessible to being dealt with by someone who has studied the biological sciences. So in no way do I want to be putting Bergson down. Teilhard comes from the Bergson tradition, and we Whiteheadians and the Teilhardians are good friends of each other. But I don't think you would think that Teilhard has answered all the questions that I have been throwing out. It just requires a different background. Mathematics is so important, and unless you do a lot of specialized study, contemporary mathematics is totally mysterious and obscure. And Teilhard doesn't. I'm not criticizing Teilhard for not knowing mathematics. I just mean Whitehead was in better position to deal with a lot of questions because he was a mathematician. And read Bergson. Another person who you probably have read somewhere along the way is William James. Whitehead admired William James greatly. That adorable genius, he calls him. He says, William James is the founder of the new philosophy that is needed. But that he had brilliant insights doesn't mean he had a systematic cosmology that dealt with the whole range of issues. So I don't think there is a really significant alternative among those who renewed cosmology in the way of which I'm speaking. But that doesn't mean that many other people did not make contributions and that you cannot add to what Whitehead did by appealing to others. It's simply that the people who say they really want to understand this particular book have reason for that, maybe more reason than they know. this book is the starting point, the sensible starting point for serious reflection about cosmology in the world today. And not many people in universities will be interested, but human beings as human beings should be interested. And that doesn't mean you have to read it. But if you can read it, if you can do it for yourself, that can be a great satisfaction in the sense I am now really beginning to understand the categories that can be used to rethink the natural world, solve the problems that blocked the further development of cosmology originally, bring together into one unified whole consciousness, mechanism, life, the quantum world. Again, not in a way that finishes the discussion for all time, but in a way that can start a discussion that is so far advanced over the one gets elsewhere that I think it's trying to do it all yourself. I think the task is so enormous that very few people really want to take it on. So, why Whitehead? Because if you want to understand the implications of modern science for the answering of questions that are, of course, asked very often in religious circles, but are human questions. They're not isolated religious questions. Process and reality is by far the best material available to us. I'll close with that.
I hope you enjoyed that. Now head over to processandreality.com or alfrednorthwhitehead.com. Sign up. Remember, tell your friends, invite your nerdy friends. Get ready for some Alfred North Whitehead. Boom shakalaka.